know it. I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
Hello everyone, welcome to Hardly Heroic. I know that I have made a lot of Warhammer videos so far, and this is no different. After making the Bretonnian video, I feel like I've had a bit of a horse, maybe cavalry fever is a better description. And I wanted to make a video that is a bit more informal. So this is not as scripted as my other videos tend to be. I'm not Auspex Tactics, so don't expect these to be coming out like every day or sometimes every minute, as it feels like with his channel. But I did want to make a video that looks at the different cavalry units in Warhammer Fantasy and tries to provide some kind of comparison between them, basically asking who has the best cavalry in Warhammer Fantasy. So I want to give a couple of disclaimers before I begin. The first is that this is primarily going to rely on a math hammer-based analysis. But that doesn't mean it's comprehensive, right? Just because you can produce a bunch of numbers and show them doesn't necessarily mean that those numbers are always conclusive. War games are not like things like chess, where everything is purely deterministic. With war games, a lot of stuff can influence how effective something is. And sometimes, in your personal play experience, you probably will actually find that your units might perform above or below what you expect. That's why we roll dice. Furthermore, this analysis relies on some simplifications, quite a few actually, that might not be reflective of the totality of battlefield conditions. I'll explain what I mean when I get into the methodology section of the video, but just keep that in mind. I'm trying to provide you with a lot more detail than you might get from some math hammer analysis, but this is always, simplified than, what the real tabletop might be. And of course, the tabletop is itself an abstraction of what you might see on a real battlefield. And finally, of course, this is purely for fun. I know that Warhammer Fantasy is, dead and buried, but if the old world drops and there's a lot of rules overlap / similarity, there might be some useful analysis that actually comes out of this. Maybe potentially we can look at this and when the rules for the old world drop, and we can see how much things have changed. That might actually be a fun idea. Let me know if you'd like to see something like that. But the other reason is simply just because I think this is fun. We, us wargame fans, we're often, very obsessive about little details. And when I was making that Bretonnian video, I was doing a lot of research into the different types of cavalry that you find in Warhammer Fantasy. And there's a lot of diversity, lots of different types and shapes of cavalry, and I've never played with all of them. That I don't think anyone can really say they have, but I really was fascinated by all the different types, and I thought it would be a fun idea to look at them and see if we could come to some kind of consensus about exactly how powerful they are. So, in terms of the rest of the video, this is going to be, like I said, a more informal podcast type. I'm going to talk about the analysis, I'm going to give some lore, we're going to look at some numbers, then, I'll give an overview of Warhammer Fantasy Combat's combat procedures. For those of you who might not be familiar with Warhammer Fantasy battles, the combat procedures can be kind of involved, so I wanted to provide that as well. Then I will give you the explanation of which cavalry units I ended up choosing before I conclude with the actual analysis and its results. So, as I said, when I made the Bretonnian video, I got the cavalry bug. I really wanted to look in depth into the different types of cavalry units that you can get in the game, and I'm trying to look at it primarily from basically three perspectives. We'll have a look at the lore for what each cavalry unit has. We'll have a look at some of their stats, or at least some of their relevant stats, and then, most importantly, we'll look at some battle simulations. Yes, that's right. For my sort of math hammer type analysis, I'm not going to simply just be providing you with sort of hit probabilities and things like that. I actually went to the effort of building a simulation system that can simulate battles between cavalry units on the tabletop using the Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition rule set. So, to those of you who might not be familiar, welcome. Yeah, interesting time to learn about Warhammer Fantasy, but I guarantee you it will be a fun one. So it is a rank and flank game, And what that means is that models in this game are formed into defined units that all have a specific set of facing and flanks, and they form themselves into a formation. Generally, we call these the ranks and files, or the rows and columns of the unit. So if you have, for example, 20 soldiers arranged in a 4 rank unit, there are 4 rows of soldiers, and each one is 5 soldiers long. For 20 in total. The idea of Warhammer Fantasy Battle is essentially for large units to indicate large numbers of soldiers. So if you have a unit of 20 that is meant to represent 20 in real life, quote unquote. However, in my personal experience, the 28mm scale of the game is not necessarily good for very large games. I know everyone who's played Warhammer Fantasy, especially 8th edition, was probably at one point in time possessed by an intense desire to play a huge battle of Warhammer Fantasy. But I guarantee you that the system itself was never really designed for those kinds of truly large-scale battles. So when it comes to representing them, they're not necessarily convenient. However, for a small to mid-sized game, I think that Warhammer Fantasy is still quite effective. However, the rules are very complicated. The basic rulebook was a weighty tome, several hundred pages long. And of course, each army has its own army book, which is not called a codex, because that's only for Warhammer 40k. But the basic idea is that all the units will essentially share the same common profile characteristics, and each unit will have different profile values based on what kind of unit it actually is. So, for example, let's take a look at a very simplified profile here. Specifically focusing on melee combat, there are some additional stats that you might need to factor in for shooting, or potentially magic. The basic profile of a unit is as follows: weapon skill, strength, toughness, initiative, wounds, attacks, leadership, and save. The weapon skill is the martial ability of the unit, and these are all basically such that the higher the value, the better the stats. So for example, weapon skill 3 is the average norm for weapon skill, but something like weapon skill 5 would be a really exceptional fighter. Strength is your physical strength, your model's physical strength. The stronger you are, the more seriously you will hit, so that's always good. And various types of things like weapons can modify your strength. Toughness is your resilience to harm, so strength and toughness are sort of opposed to each other, where the stronger you are, the higher, the easier time you'll have hurting an enemy, but the tougher you are, the harder it will be to hurt you. Initiative is the model's speed and reflexes. So this is very, very important in this game, because initiative is used for determining the order that units attack in. So models with high initiative will, generally speaking, attack before models with low initiative. Wounds are the number of hits that a model can survive. So the way that you should think about it is that one wound is essentially equivalent to one serious mortal injury that a human can sustain. So the average human profile, generally most profiles in the game, have one wound, which means that if in a unit of 20, you have 20 wounds. Essentially, you can think of it like a sort of an HP, right? And as casualties are inflicted, you are losing soldiers. Really, really tough characters, heroes and certain types of beasts and things, they will have multiple wounds, which means that they can survive multiple hits that would have seriously killed a man-sized person. For example, something like it's like a Beastmen Stegodon or something like that. Something like that, which will have at least, 5 wounds or something crazy. That would mean that it would take 5 serious mortal wounds to kill it. More wounds definitely means more survivability. Your attacks are just the amount of attacks that a character will do in melee. So the more attacks that you have, the better you will be. The amount of actual hits that you can do, again, these can be modified. And your leadership is your last on-profile stat. That is a measure of your model's courage and or morale. Morale is a very important part of any rank and flank game, because units don't necessarily have to be fully killed to be defeated. Oftentimes, as it was the case in real warfare, if a unit or groups of units or soldiers fled from the battlefield, that was when they were often most in harm, because then they're being ridden down by enemy cavalry or something like that, and casualties will spike enormously when a unit is running away, as opposed to when they are formed up and ready to fight. Finally, you have the save value. The save is essentially the protection of the unit, and you get 2 types, armor and ward saves. Armor is essentially a mundane sort of physical protection, and ward saves are magical or supernatural or some other kind of special protection that the unit is granted. One of the features of Warhammer is that the armor save is not just given on the profile. It actually is calculated from the stats that a unit has. So for example, if your model has light armor and a shield, they have a 5+ armor save, which means they resist damage on a 5 or more. But if you, let's say, put them on a horse, then they would have a 4+, because each aspect of their protection, the armor, the shield, the mount, adds an additional value to their armor save. It was always fun for me to sort of sit there and work out the armor saves, although I can tell, with a lot of people, working out saves can be very tedious, especially if there are lots of different, complicated rules for what might add to a save and what might not. There are many layers to the actual combat system. Obviously, you have magic and shooting attacks and melee attacks. We don't have time to cover every single aspect here. But we will be focusing specifically on the melee attacks because we're looking at cavalry, and for our purposes, we're talking about melee cavalry. There are missile cavalry units in the game. Famous, ones include like Empire Pistoliers or Illyrian Reavers for the High Elves. But those are primarily, their job is to shoot at the enemy and then run away. You don't want to be running your missile cavalry into melee battles if you can help it. When it comes to the actual procedure for fighting in melee, there's a basic sort of causality here, where you first need to see if you can hit. If you've hit, then you need to see if your hit was actually sufficiently strong to be mortal. Sometimes, of course, you can hit someone and the wound is very insignificant, it's very minor. So that's why you need that. Then they need to see if the opponent's armor or protection saves them, and then finally we have a casualty, or at least a wound is generated. So that's the basic procedure for a one-on-one fight between two models. Once you start adding multiple models into a whole unit, that's when things start to get a lot more complicated. And then stuff like morale really factors in, because of course, most of your unit can still be alive, even if they took some casualties. But if they're poorly led, i.e. their leadership is low, then they could run away. So even though you've got a lot of them, their ability to resist the psychological effects of warfare is minimal, and so they run away and you lose all of them. For the most part, leadership is very important to battles, because most units will have a leadership, and they will obviously be susceptible to running away if they lose in a fight. One of the notable exceptions is, of course, the undead, who are unbreakable. They will never run away because they're not technically alive. So that makes them really good for bogging down a unit, but as we'll see later, the undead do have some negative penalties to go along with the fact that you can't break them in battle. Okay, so I wanted to take a look at the different sort of dimensions of this of this process, and we'll break down the hitting, the wounding, the saves separately. So to start, to hit a model in combat, you need to look at your weapon skill and their weapon skill. So the attacker's weapon skill and the defender's weapon skill. The units will attack in initiative order, which is why initiative values are very important. If your initiative is so low that your opponent's initiative is higher, they have a high possibility of striking down your units before they even have a chance to strike. So initiative is a very important stat, and it can't be overstated just how important it is to a fight, because low initiative models will, generally speaking, struggle against high initiative models. There are some exceptions to that case, but you don't want to have a unit that's very slow, if you can help it. So in terms of the way that things are actually fought, the front rank of the actual unit is the one that does the fighting. They'll make their attacks, and you have an opportunity to provide some limited supporting attacks from units behind. In a weird way, Warhammer is both very specific as a representation of warfare and also not specific at all. It's sometimes very realistic and sometimes not realistic at all, The idea that only the front rank can actually attack does make some sense if you think about just a formation of soldiers. Only the front guys really are in a position to attack the enemy front rank. But of course, other people from the sides might try to do stuff as well. So yeah, supporting attacks are how you can get some additional attacks for your unit. You shouldn't be thinking of it as every model in the unit can attack when it makes an attack. That's not how it works here. But once you've determined, what you need to hit, you'll look at this chart, which I'll show you later. Then you need to roll some dice equal to the amount of attacks that you have, and every hit that you score is a value that is that d6 greater than or equal to the hit value that you need. A 6 always hits and a 1 always misses, so you have to keep that in mind. Finally, once you've determined how many hits you have, then you have to determine if you wound. So you will compare the strength of your model plus any modifiers against the toughness of the enemy plus any modifiers, and see if you can wound them. Generally, you want to have a high strength attacking a low toughness, but your mileage can vary. Strength is useful as well. Just not only does it help you wound a target easier, but it also negatively affects their armor. Because what's represented here is that the strength of the model is undermining or penetrating the armor worn by the defender. So very high strength units will have an easy time wounding their target and also punching through their armor. Once you've wounded an enemy in the same dice rolling process as with hitting, now you need to see if they can take a save. So as I've mentioned, you've got armor saves, which can be modified by strength, and ward saves, which are generally unmodified. There can be some special exceptions where the ward save is changed. And then you will take your save to negate the wound. So this is the defender now who has been hit. They will roll dice and try to better or exceed the armor value that's listed, or the ward save value that's listed. And then any unsaved wounds will become casualties and or damage. So if your models only have one wound, every wound that you take removes a model. But if they have multiple wounds, then you have to tally up the number of wounds that are caused and then stack them onto appropriate models, only taking them away when you've lost a sufficient number to actually remove the number of models for the number of wounds for one model. Importantly, in this particular game, and it's different from, you might be, if you're from a Warhammer 40k background, this will be different, is that the save stack. So units that have an armor and a ward save are generally very resilient to harm, because when you fail the one save, you can take the other, which means that you have double layers of protection. So even if your saves are not very good, the fact that you have two of them, and it requires 2 layers of failure basically to get through to the unit and hurt them, that tends to make units very, very resilient to harm. And you don't want to get into a situation where you're attacking a unit that has one of good of either, really, because they can still, harm you. It was the case for many, many years in Warhammer 40k that you could either take your invulnerable save, your invul save, or your armor save. But things have slowly drifted as time has gone on, with the introduction of things like Feel No Pains and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's how it was in Warhammer 8th edition. So after both sides have had their opportunity to attack, presuming, of course, that that is something that's going to happen, both sides will do their attacks, and if one isn't wiped out, i.e. there has some units left, you will tally the scores to determine who actually won that combat. Remember when I talked about morale? Well, here it comes in. So normally, the way that you calculate your combat resolution score is you count the number of wounds you inflicted onto the enemy unit, plus you count the number of ranks that you have. Usually it's 5 files per rank, and that will give you a final score. The idea being that if you have lots of ranks, then you probably have a sufficient number of soldiers to press against the enemy in a sort of a pushing match if it came to it. You've got enough guys that you can, through force of momentum, just push through the enemy. There are a couple of other modifiers, but I don't want to get into that detail now. The winner is the side that has the highest score, and the loser then has to take what we call a break test. Basically, they've lost the fight, they've seen their comrades killed, or maybe they just don't think they can harm the enemy. So that losing side essentially has a moment of wavering morale. This is your chance where the unit might rout from the fight, be chased down and killed for much less effort than it is to actually fight a unit in combat. And these break tests are basically taken against leadership. You roll 2d6 and try to get under the leadership value. The leadership value is, of course, modified by the score. So if you lose combat by a lot, let's say, for example, 5, then that will be a -5 penalty to your leadership value, which can make it really hard to roll 2 dice under that value. Generally, the higher leadership you have, the more psychological damage you can sustain in combat. But you can always roll, you could always roll poorly and fail. Of course, if you roll a double 1, then that unit has what we call insane bravery, and they stand regardless of the fact that they've been slaughtered. Sometimes you can have that happen, and it can be a really good moment where a unit that was never expected to do well suddenly doesn't run away, and that might lock another unit into combat which it didn't want to necessarily be in, and of course expose its flank. Remember, this is a rank and flank game, so there are always advantages to... Generally speaking, you never not want to go for a flank if you have a flank, because there are lots of advantages to that. Now, of course, not every unit will run away. I mentioned, of course, undead. One of their advantages, of course, is that they're unbreakable. They will not run away from any kind of battle, no matter how badly they lose. So they will tend to fight to the death, which means that to get rid of undead units, you generally speaking have to annihilate them all. You can't just make them run away, which you might be able to do in other armies. So here are just some charts that we had to know as kids. It is always funny to me that Games Workshop thought that they could sell this kind of game to children. Especially looking at the complexity of things like Age of Sigmar and Warhammer 10th edition now. It is very funny to me that they thought that they could sell something like this to children. Granted, we still, when I was a kid, we still learned how to play this kind of game. But it is very funny looking at it now. So you can see that we were comparing your attacker and your defender's weapon skill. It goes all the way up to 10. If you have, say, for example, weapon skill 10, or let's say a better example, weapon skill 5, then you will need a 5 to, you'll hit enemies that are weaker than you, so smaller weapon skill on 3s, and enemies that are about your strength, but not about your skill, but not more than double on 4s. You will have some difficulties if you have very low weapon skill. The baseline is about 3. So if you have weapon skill 3, you'll hit on 4s for quite a sufficient amount. And then when you get to weapon skill that's double your weapon skill, then you start to hit on 5s. But remember, of course, that a 6 always hits and a 1 always misses. So even if you've got terrible, abysmal weapon skill, you can still try and go for a good hit. Okay, and similarly, we see this with the toughness. Toughness is a little bit more diverse because there are potentially much more ways that toughness and strength can be modified. And you can see there that one of the golden rules about these tables is that if you have the same value as your enemy, you always hit on a 4. And that is sort of the anchor base point. So toughness 4 against strength 4, you hit on 4s. And then you can work out where you need to go from there. Believe me, it looks intimidating, but once you've actually used it and sort of been playing for a while, you get a general sense of what the values actually need to be, for the most part. Okay, so I thought I would run through an example combat between a unit of 10 Empire Halberdiers and a unit of 10 Orc Boys. So, our Empire Halberdiers have weapon skill 3, strength 3, toughness 3, 1 wound, 3 initiative, 1 attack, and leadership 7. They're wearing light armor, as you can see on the right, and they have a halberd, which in the rules gives them +1 strength. That's a pretty useful ability, especially for humans who have generally average strength. The Orc Boys, by contrast, have a similar profile, except they're toughness 4 and initiative 2. So they're much harder to hit because of their toughness, but they tend to be much slower in terms of initiative. And they're armed with light armor and a shield, which gives them a 5+ armor save. They've got a hand weapon, which is just a generic weapon that anyone can have. The phrase hand weapon covers everything from finely crafted elven arming swords all the way to basically bones that are used as clubs. They don't confer any special advantage or any negative penalty. They're just hand weapons. Every unit essentially has one. But because they have a hand weapon and a shield, they get a special 6+ ward save, which is called a parry save, that is given to them if they're attacked in the front. Basically, this represents the ability of the orcs or of any unit really, to parry an enemy attack with a shield. Not a great save, mind you, but it's still something. So, if we look at our combat, our halberdiers have 10 attacks, because they have 5 base, because they have 2 ranks of 5 each, and they get 5 additional supporting attacks. They'll hit on 4s, because their enemy has the same weapon skill as they do, and they'll wound on a 4 due to the halberd. Now, if you go back to the toughness table, you'll see that the Empire soldiers have strength 3, and the Orc boys have toughness 4. So normally they would hit on 5s, which is quite a significantly worse result than hitting on 4s. They go basically from having a 33% chance to wound to having a 50% chance to wound. Quite an improvement. The Orcs will have a 6+ armor save, because the strength 4 of the halberd attack negates 1 point of armor, so their 5+ goes to a 6+, and they get their 6+ parry save as well. So the halberdiers will have a higher initiative, and they will get to attack first. And that brings us, of course, to the end of sort of the example combat. So from everything from here, we're specifically looking at our cavalry units. I'll explain additional details as we need to, but you can get an idea of how complicated it can be. But on the other hand, it is quite straightforward. There's a lot of details to it, but the process is simple once you get it. You are always rolling to hit, then to wound, then to save, hit, wound, save, and so on and so forth. Now, I do want to give some disclaimers regarding the specific choice of cavalry units. So firstly, the first rule is that I only chose things that have the cavalry type for the comparison. There are different types of units that might be considered to be cavalry. Like, for example, in some armies, very fast units that are not cavalry fulfill a function like cavalry, certain types of animal warhounds and so on and so forth. But if they don't have the cavalry type, I didn't include them. Secondly, there are armies that have lots of cavalry options, and there are armies that have few cavalry options. I decided for this comparison, I was only going to pick armies that had cavalry options that I thought and were particularly distinctive or iconic. Okay, so I want to give a quick disclaimer for this cavalry comparison. So firstly, in order to be considered in this comparison, a unit has to have the cavalry type, for the purposes of its actual unit type. There are different types of units in Warhammer, and there are lots of armies that have units that are not called cavalry that still fulfill a cavalry function. For example, something like a gyrocopter in a dwarf army. But in order for it to be included here, it has to have the cavalry type. Secondly, there are different types of cavalry units that exist in Warhammer. Some armies will have a lot of cavalry choices, some armies will have relatively few cavalry choices. For our comparison, well, my comparison, I decided that I would only stick to very distinctive or iconic cavalry units. So that does mean that I might be excluding a cavalry unit that you're particularly fond of or that you think is particularly important. I'm sorry about that. I don't have all the time in the world. So I had to be relatively circumspect. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm not going to consider every single variation that you could with cavalry. So different types of weapons and stuff like that. That can be settled relatively easily with some minor math hammer. I'm trying to simulate some battles here, so I don't want to look at every single variation. I'm trying to keep relatively consistent themes. And yeah, this is going to provide you with an overview, but it's not going to be a 100% comprehensive breakdown. Also, I have to admit some bias here. I do definitely think about the lore of a unit / its coolness. This will become more apparent as we go into the list of units, but that is a bias that I want to disclose, just so that people, so that if you want to call me biased in the comments, you're, more than welcome to do that, but keep in mind that I already know. Okay, so let's talk about our cavalry units. So first up, I thought we would start with a very iconic, distinctive unit, a unit that I myself have a lot of, and these are Knights of the Empire. So in the Empire, you've got various knightly orders, and these are nominally independent of the actual Imperial State Army. They are professional, almost somewhat professional at least, fraternities of warriors who are all essentially noble in blood, although this can sometimes vary. And they're all gathered together into chapters that fight ostensibly for themselves, but often they will fight in the purview of the Imperial Army. A elector count or other such person will have to appeal to a knightly order for help. And it is the purview of the knightly order's chapter master to say no, that they're not going to help. But generally speaking, the knights recognize that they need to serve in combat. And the knightly orders are also quite invested in mercantilism as well. There are plenty of orders whose wealth derives not from purely ownership of land or something like that, but rather from all of their investments that they make in various other types of things. They are very strongly based, in terms of their armor at least, on Germanic Renaissance heavy cavalry knights. You can definitely see that they're covered in armor. They have the standard human profile, except for Weapon Skill 4 and Leadership 8, which is the only thing that really differentiates them from other Empire units. But the standout feature, to me at least, is the fact that they have full plate armor. Full plate armor, in this context, comes from dwarf forges. There are large there are large communities of dwarfs who live in the Empire, and these communities include large numbers of smiths who use the secrets of dwarven metallurgy and forging to make high-quality suits of armor for humans to wear, often, at great expense to the humans. But it does give them a 1+ armor save, which is the best possible armor save that you can get in the game. And on a human unit, that is exceptional. A 1+ armor save can protect you from quite a lot, because it means that when you get hit, you have to roll a d6, and ostensibly on a 1, you succeed. But remember, of course, that a 1 always fails. So even if you do have a 1+ armor save, you still have to you still fail it on a 1. So you got to keep that in mind. Anyway, the weapons that they have are lances, which I feel is an iconic knight unit. Although there are variations where you can use great weapons. For example, Knights of the White Wolf, they prefer to fight with cavalry hammers. There are certain other knightly orders that will prefer to fight with greatswords, although fighting with a greatsword on horseback would probably be a terrible idea. And they are a pretty effective unit. Pretty much every Empire army should consider having at least one unit of knights, because they're basically one of your strongest knight hammer units that you can get. And they are relatively cheap too. They're not super expensive, for the point. Certainly not compared to other units on this list. So next up, we have famous Dragon Princes of Caledor. Caledor is one of the provinces in the High Elf realm of Ulthuan. Every province, or part at least, every kingdom, has to provide, its own armies. And the Dragon Princes are famous because they come from the region of Caledor, which was in distant times famed for its Dragon Knights. And when I say Dragon Knights, I mean actually elves who rode to war on the back of dragons. As the Warhammer timeline has progressed, dragons have become increasingly rare in the setting, to the point where dragons can only be roused from their slumber for exceptional circumstances or by exceptional individuals. The idea that Caledor could field loads of relatively more common knights on Dragonback is no longer possible. Of course, that hasn't stopped the Caledorian nobles from being obsessed with dragons, and as you can see, they take to the field now on horses that wear barding that makes them look like the dragons of old. Dragon Princes are a very elite cavalry. They're one of the more elite cavalries that you can find, and they have a commensurate skill, having a very, very high weapon skill, but they tend to suffer from problems of having the base elf profile in other respects, like, for example, strength 3 and toughness 3. They also have this funny, well, not funny, but they also have another rule that makes them immune to fire attacks, pretty much. They have a 2+ ward save against fire attacks. And let me tell you, you will only get to use that 2+ ward save once. You will play it against somebody who brings a fire attack, because they don't know that Dragon Princes have that rule, and they will use them on the Dragon Princes because they're a scary cavalry unit, and then the Dragon Princes will laugh at their 2+ ward save, and you will never again use that 2+ ward save. Pretty much anyone who knows that Dragon Princes have a 2+ ward save knows not to use fire attacks against them. They do have a good save. They have a 2+ armor save, which is pretty much the best save that you can get on a normal means. And because they're high elves who have the always strikes first special rule and very high base initiative, they're generally speaking very likely to strike before the enemy does, which means that you can, in theory, charge them into a unit, inflict horrific casualties on the enemy, and attack them such that their response back is relatively minimal. Continuing with the theme of elves, we have Wood Elves Wild Riders. These are wild elves on cavalry. As you can see, they're significantly less armored, significantly less equipped than our previous elf cavalry. These are guys who are part of an elite formation within the Wood Elf Society. They protect what's called the King's Glade, which is where the king of the Wood Elves, Orion, goes to slumber. There's part of an annual seasonal cycle for Wood Elf Society, from spring all the way to winter. And when spring comes around, Orion will emerge from his slumber with the other Wild Riders and go on something called a Wild Hunt, which will be essentially an attack of vengeance on the enemies of the Wood Elves. And of course, at the forefront will be the Wild Riders, who are, in a way, suffused with Fey power. It's often been noted that many of the Wild Riders are distinct from the rest of their Wood Elf kin, and much more Fey or supernatural than the rest of them. However, despite the fact that they have relatively primitive-looking equipment, I mean, their horses don't even have barding, really, you shouldn't underestimate them, because they are suffused with a lot of supernatural/Fey power, and they have a lot of attack potential. Wood Elf units normally are quite good at ranged attacks, but these guys can generate a lot of melee attacks because of rules such as Devastating Charge. They have Frenzy, and they cause Fear, which is very unusual for a faction like this. However, their main issue is probably their lack of durability. They don't have a lot of armor, as you can see. They're not very heavily equipped, and they're probably not going to have access to many of the other weapons or abilities that other knight units or cavalry units might get access to. So you can think of them as a very, very much like a glass cannon, where in battle they can inflict quite a significant hit, but you shouldn't allow them to take hits as well. You should always be aiming to use these to hit enemy flanks, enemy rear charges, where the amount of damage that they can receive in return is fairly minimal compared to frontal cavalry charges. Lastly, for our final elf unit, we have the Dark Elf Cold One Knights. Now, these are one of the most unusual cavalry on this list, because we don't tend to think of elves as riding dinosaurs. But these are elite Dark Elf warriors who are mounted on dinosaur mounts called Cold Ones. These creatures are captured by Dark Elves, taken from the jungles of Lustria in the south, and sort of trained to be a cavalry unit. Now, the thing that I want to emphasize is that these are not necessarily pliant beasts. In order for a Dark Elf to even get onto the Cold One, he has to bathe himself in slime, so that the lizard won't instantly turn on him and tear him to pieces. So it is quite a significantly costly process to use these cavalry, but they do have quite a number of benefits, because you're pairing the sadistic prowess of a Dark Elf Knight, a veteran warrior, with the primal fury of a lizard. They're very powerful cavalry. They have lots of different rules. They cause fear. They can reroll ones for wounds. They are very strong, but they do have one major rule that can sometimes turn against them, which is that the cavalry unit, specifically the lizard, suffers from stupidity, which can mean that it might not do what you want it to do. The idea of some very noble Dark Elf cavalry being halted because their lizards are too stupid to follow their orders is a very funny idea to me. But don't mistake that for being weak. These are definitely some very, very strong units, and they will tear through, in some cases literally, a lot of the stuff that they attack. Moving on from the elves, we're getting a little bit into some of the chaos forces. So we have our Chaos Knights here, and they are also one of the elite super heavy cavalry units in that they also have a 1+ save. In fact, they are the other 1+ save, but they have a much better profile than Empire Knights. Their 1+ save comes from the fact that they are clad in chaos armor, which is ostensibly made by chaos dwarves, and of course they've got these massive war horses as well. Each individual chaos warrior on a horse who becomes a Chaos Knight is a very formidable fighter. You have to be quite formidable before you even get onto horseback. In a might makes right society like the Chaos Society, this is significantly difficult, and often many of the warriors who try will end up being killed, and possibly even eaten by the horses. These horses are not normal. And you can upgrade these by further taking chaos marks, but just the base profile is very, very good. You have good weapon skill, good strength, good toughness, high initiative. You cause fear as well, which I think is appropriate for cavalry that looks like they're running on the cover of a Metallica cover or something. So yeah, these are very strong cavalry. The Blood Knights are our other top-rated cavalry. If you had to make a list of the best cavalry units in the game, if you had to see something on an online article, Blood Knights would probably be at the very top of that list. They are vampire knights who are essentially following the martial example led by the vampire Aborash, a legendary vampire. All vampires suffer from bloodthirst, where if they don't drink blood, they will eventually degenerate into feral creatures. Aborash was a vampire who managed to break his thirst for blood by killing a dragon in combat and drinking its blood, thus becoming a ultimate sort of warrior type person. Someone who had all of the advantages of a vampire, being immortal, being fast, quick, strong, but none of the disadvantages, i.e. no longer needing to consume blood. So Blood Knights have sort of worked in that image ever since, trying to achieve that same level of martial perfection. Now, they have very, very powerful stats. They have a 2+ armor save, they're unbreakable in combat, and they have an elite vampire profile. So very high weapon skill, very high strength, high initiative. In a lot of ways, these are some of the best cavalry just on profiles that you can get. However, I do want you to be aware that they have some weaknesses. Firstly, they will take casualties because of the unstable rule if they lose combat. And this could be tricky because they only have 1 wound each, which means that even if you lose combat by a little bit, you've still lost a very valuable vampire who might have been hard to kill otherwise. And there can be certain instances where you charge into a massive units that are simply too large to break, no matter how many attacks you do, and you end up losing combat and taking casualties, which is definitely the worst way for a vampire to die. They still only have a 1 wound, and they have no ward save, so they can be a lot more fragile than you think. Even though they have amazing stats, and really, genuinely amazing stats, they can be more fragile than you think. So you do have to be a little bit circumspect, I think, when you're thinking about how to use Blood Knights. Moving on to the other undead unit, we have Skeletal Horsemen. These are undead horsemen from the ancient Neherkaran human empire, which was the precursor civilization that rose and fell in the distant past of Warhammer Fantasy's timeline. All of the immortal soldiers that you see here were once living soldiers who were bound to the will of tomb kings and lich priests by powerful undead magic. Essentially what you get is a Bronze Age era depiction of cavalry. You can see that these guys were buried with their steeds and they come back riding skeletal horses. They're not wearing armor at all, because that wasn't really the standard of the day. And they're armed very basically with spears and shields. These are very cheap cavalry, but they're very, very weak. They have very low weapon skill of 2 and initiative of 2. I really struggle to say anything good about them. We'll talk about the Skeletal Horsemen later. But they are the other undead unit. If you want to have a better, stronger unit in a Tomb King's army, I think you would want to use something probably closer to one of the beasts rather than the horsemen. The horsemen are, for all intents and purposes, there to be chaff. Moving on, so we get to the Lizardmen, who are where the Dark Elves get their dinosaurs from. So here we have Cold One riders. Unlike the Dark Elves, these riders have a natural relationship with the Saurus that they ride, with the Cold Ones that they ride, and thus they don't have to force them into a sort of slavery in order to work for them. And these are quite an effective cavalry choice. You have a tide of teeth and claws, as I would say. I've actually been on the receiving end of a cavalry charge from one of these. They are a lot more formidable than their equipment might suggest. Despite the relatively almost Stone Age looking equipment, they have some really good rules. So one is that attacks, when they roll to attack and they roll a 6, that generates an additional attack, which can add up, especially if you get really lucky and roll a bunch of 6s. They're also immune to psychology, which means that enemy units that cause fear or terror don't affect them. And they're cold-blooded, which means that they'll roll 3d6 and discard the highest when taking leadership tests, which makes it much less likely for them to fail in the first place. I would say they're a pretty solid cavalry unit. I think in terms of their equipment, they probably could be a little bit lacking, but the Cold One is definitely a powerful mount to have. And when you pair it with a Lizard man who knows how to bring out the best in the Cold One, I think it's probably a much more formidable cavalry force than you might give them credit for. We're almost at the end, so now we're looking at our Orcs and Goblins Boar Boys. These are orcs who, for whatever reason, decide that riding to battle is more fun than running, and they've managed to tame powerful war boars that you can see that they're riding on. These are quite powerful beasts. Each boar is significantly dangerous. To some extent, you might even question if the boar is not more dangerous than the orc. They do have standard orc profile, so they have average weapon skill, but very low initiative and also quite high toughness. The boar itself is quite interesting because it can get strength 5 on the charge, and orcs, will have some additional strength bonuses because they love fighting, but this is a unit that has not as high durability as you might seem. The orcs don't have heavy armor, and they don't have complicated weapons that you might want to have for a cavalry charge. They can get at most spears. And that means that the unit is not necessarily as powerful as you might think it would be. Furthermore, and this is not factored into the actual simulation that I've got here, but orc units are notorious for their problems with leadership and animosity, right? Orc units can often fight amongst each other because that's a fun rule that's, represented in the fluff, and mechanically it's represented actually in the game, and it is part of the fun of orcs, right? If you want an army that always listens to whatever you say, you should be playing undead. If you want an army that's going to potentially fight amongst itself for a whole turn, you kind of have to sort of play orcs. you have to accept that that's going to be part and parcel of playing orcs. Sometimes you'll get really lucky and all your units will charge home into combat. Other times you'll be really unlucky and your units will squabble amongst each other while getting shot at by the enemy. So using Boar Boys as a cavalry unit requires a bit of luck, because you need to make sure that they're in a position where their charge will be the most effective. And to get to that position, you've got to rely on the fact that they're not going to fail any of their poor leadership roles. We're almost done with our list. So bringing up the other Chaos Army unit, the Beastmen of Chaos, we've got Centigors. Centigors are unique on this list because they are technically cavalry and they count as cavalry and all of that stuff, but they don't actually have a mount. Every other unit in this game has a mount, and in Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition, mounts can also make their own attacks. So Centigors are inherently disadvantaged in the fact that they count as both the cavalry and the rider, so they don't have a split profile. But Centigors are beastmen that have these obvious, centaur-like mutations. They're described as being generally rowdy, rambunctious. One of the Beastmen characters, who is a Centigor himself, is famous for being kind of a drunk. And they're relatively lightly armed. You can see they don't really have much in the way of armor. And they will, at most, maybe have some spears. The two things that save the Centigor unit, in my opinion, are their Drunken and Primal Fury rolls. Drunken gives you some bonuses, potentially things like Stubborn, at the beginning of the battle, and Primal Fury potentially allows you to get Hatred, which can be really, really helpful for re-rolling your hits in combat. But remember, these units have barely any protection at all, so they will fold very easily to a shooting attack, and especially, you don't want them being charged by something that has a very, very powerful attack. That will not end well for them. Finally, the last unit, but many people would not say the least, are Grail Knights, who are from Bretonnia. Now, Bretonnia, of course, as you might remember, are the faction, that inspired me to make this whole thing in the first place. I made a video about, defending Bretonnia, and sometimes the weird things that people say about it. And Grail Knights are one of the most elite cavalry units in a cavalry elite army. These are veteran knights who have gone on a quest, what's called the Grail quest, to find a Holy Grail. And when they do so, they are granted the ability to sup from it, and that gives them divine/magical powers. And they are basically the apex of traditional Bretonnian military/religious might. Grail Knights each of them is a hero who has fought, in dozens of battles, killed hundreds of enemies potentially. They're not anything to sneeze at. They have basically the top tier human profile that you can get for cavalry. Plus, they have a couple of other really nice bonuses, like the Lance Formation, which gives them extra hits, because again, Bretonnia are the elite cavalry force, and a 6+ ward save that becomes a 5+ ward save for high strength attacks. They do have decent armor at 2+, but they don't necessarily have the hardest hitting weapons. For a unit that is so elite, you might expect them to have more powerful deadly weapons than lances, but they do have lances, so keep that in mind. So now let's get into the math hammer of it all. Let's look at the actual sort of methodology that I'm going to be using for this video. So each unit will face off against every other unit that we have. So we have in total 11 units. So every unit will face 10 battles essentially, and every matchup will be fought 10,000 times. Yeah, that's that's a lot of times. But I really wanted to be thorough. I wanted to make sure that when we looked at the results, it wasn't like a minor statistical wobble. After 10,000 fights, we can get a real sense of how good a unit might be against another unit. And we can look at that, on aggregate. Each unit, importantly, will also get a turn as the attacker and the defender. So every unit will get a chance to be the attacker, and every unit will get a chance to be a defender. And this is important because that also means one unit gets to count as charging and the other unit is charged. That means, of course, that in Warhammer Fantasy, having the ability to charge is very useful, because certain types of weapons, like cavalry weapons, like lances and spears, only give their benefits, usually just additional strength, when the unit charges. So being the unit that gets to charge and also being the unit that is charged, that will definitely significantly affect the outcome of the battle. Finally, because flank and rear charges are unequivocally better, it's always better to flank or rear charge an enemy if you can. I will just be counting frontal attacks so that we can essentially just look at a comparison between these two units. In terms of the actual units, we're looking at 15 models per unit. Now, of course, I know that the points cost for these units are going to be different. Some units are going to have really disproportionate point costs compared to others. I will factor that into the analysis. You'll see that later. And I tried to, wherever possible, keep to the iconic loadout of that unit. So, generally speaking, I think it's more common for knights to have lances. I would prefer to give them lances where possible, as opposed to, say, for example, great weapons. Those things will also, influence the outcomes a little bit, but not to any degree, that I would care to study. This is already a significantly complicated, endeavor, and I didn't want to give myself more work. I'm not Auspex Tactics, who's turning out a video, every day pretty much. If you wanted me to go into more detail, please go ahead, write in the comments below, and I will provide you, additional details as and where I have them. But I also wanted to make sure that no unit has command upgrades or other characters. It's purely just 2 cavalry units are charging at each other, and we want to see who comes out on top in this head-to-head cavalry battle. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that cavalry have multiple uses besides just charging at other cavalry in head-to-head fights. Oftentimes, you want to use your cavalry to attack the flank of a weak unit so that you can roll them up. And the classic hammer-anvil strategy is to use an infantry unit to accept the charge of an enemy unit and then hit that flank with a cavalry unit. Now, these are much more complicated, like, tactical elements that you need to be aware of when you're using this cavalry. And other types of cavalry can have different types of uses, especially, to bait charges from enemy units. I didn't model any of that here. This is purely just looking at which of the units will win in a head-to-head fight against the other units. So we can establish some kind of, like, power ranking in terms of the different cavalry. So let's look at the results. So we have a lot of results to get through, mostly divided into attacker and defender. What that means is basically when you see the attacker summaries, they are when these units are attacking, so when they're getting to charge, and then defender is when those units are defending. So just looking at these results here, we've got a couple of things. We've got the number of times that they win, the number of times that they lose, how many times they won by destroying the enemy, and how many times they won by routing the enemy, which is, of course, as you know, quite different. Destroying an enemy is much more difficult than routing them. As you can see, top tier units, there's quite a difference in terms of the performance over the number of fights that you're expecting, because this is over all of the fights. Our units that you can pause this if you want and actually specifically look at it, but I do want to cover a little bit more. So we can see the same summary, but just for the defenders. Attacking versus defending, you can see that most units generally struggle when they're defending, and that makes sense, right? Because they don't have the charge bonus. Most of these units are armed with cavalry weapons, so they only get those benefits when they charge. When you're defending, you will have to take that first attack from the enemy, and that can be quite significant, and that will weigh up your ability to defend. It's often more difficult to defend than it is to attack. So one of the golden axioms of cavalry is to not let yourself be charged, is to always charge where you can. You don't want to be caught flat-footed and killed. There's also quite a disparity difference in terms of the units. Generally speaking, units will rout more enemies than they kill. It really, will depend. Our poor Skeletal Horsemen barely ever destroy any units, but they far often than not, manage to rout them, or at least statistically more, although it's not, not very good. Okay, so this table here is a lot of numbers, trust me. I know, I've been looking at them for a while. But what you see here are just the win rates for each of the individual types of units. So the way that you want to look at this is that when 4 units that are attacking, the Empire Knight fights against the Grail Knight, Dragon Princes, so on and so forth, up to the Boar Boys. And, for each unit. So, for example, the Empire Knights, obviously they don't fight themselves, but against Grail Knights, they won 382 times. Against Dragon Princes, they won 10,000 times, which is really funny. Against, units like the Skeletal Horsemen, they won 10,000 times. So that's just the number of times. So you can see here broken down in some more granularity, like which unit really struggled against which other unit, and which unit managed to do really well. If you look at, for example, the Blood Knights, you can see that they did really, really well. They tended to win a lot of their fights, as well as, the Grail Knights as well, but we'll continue that analysis. Here are this is the same table, but from the perspective of the defender. So in this table, you have Empire Knights defending against Grail Knights, Dragon Princes, so on and so forth, and the numbers are significantly worse. When a unit is defending against an attack, they tend to perform much worse than if they're doing the attack themselves. There are just all sorts of reasons that you want to attack first. But even then, some units can still perform reasonably well. Like, for example, with the Blood Knights fighting Centigors, even though they were defending, they still won the majority of the times. So it's not as if it's not as if the Centigors performed, sufficiently well. They still struggled quite a lot fighting the Blood Knights. So it is something, you've got to keep in mind. Anyway, I just wanted to compile a nice, easy table, a chart, so that you can take a look at the results more easily visualized. So here we have basically what we call a rank comparison. So I just ranked the performance of the units based on their win rates, and then we can see them represented here. So attacker, defender, and sort of total. And if we're just looking at this, this assessment, we can see that there's a very clear bias in terms of which units are winning. The top units are Grail Knights, Blood Knights, and Chaos Knights. And then the bottom units are Skeletal Horsemen, Boar Boyz, and Centigors. The other units will fall in the middle somewhere. Sometimes a unit will be more sufficient, and sometimes the margin between one unit and the other is not as wide as you think. But the top three and the bottom three are definitely, clearly established. So yeah, we have our top three. At number 1 is Grail Knights, number 2 are Blood Knights, number 3 are Chaos Knights. And our bottom 3 are Centigors, Boar Boyz, and Skeletal Horsemen. So I thought what I would do right now is to talk about why these units do well / poorly in comparison to the others. Just to talk kind of briefly about why I think some of the units did well and why I think others suffered, so that we can round up this analysis. Because now we have a power ranking to the various different units. We can see that there's sort of an established pecking order. So yeah, let's talk about it. So starting with our Chaos Knights, well, these are very obviously one of the very best general purpose cavalry units that you can get. In terms of the types of units, you've got a +1 armor save, which is really, really good. But unlike the Empire Knights, they also have good base stats. So you're not relying purely on your ability to charge. So you have high strength and high toughness, and you have fear, and that can be useful for canceling the fear of enemy units, fear that is caused by enemy units, which is really helpful. And you can use that fear to inflict additional damage on weaker units like Empire Knights who don't have fear themselves. So when it comes to it, you have a very nice all-around package for delivering very efficient cavalry charges. Plus, Chaos Knights don't have issues with leadership and so on and so forth. They're quite reliable as far as cavalry goes because they have a high leadership and they don't have issues like stupidity, or frenzy. Well, they can get frenzy, but you know what I mean. You can use Chaos Marks to provide additional potential to these knights, but even as a base package, they're still really, really good, and that is not something that a lot of other cavalry units can say. Because they have good stats in general and that 1+ save, they are also less affected by not charging than other units. But you have to keep in mind that they are quite expensive for the points cost. Moving on to our second best unit, which is not what I expected, are the Blood Knights. So these are our ultra elite cavalry, no surprises there. Really good attack rate, lots of good armor, very good initiative, especially for undead. In terms of the base profile, I think they pretty much have the best base profile of any cavalry unit. But remember what I said about their durability issues. Well, they still only have 1 wound, and because they have no ward save and only toughness 4, they can still be killed if you can penetrate through their armor and get through their, weapon skill. Even though they have a very high weapon skill, remember, you only suffer significant penalties to weapon skill if you are double the weapon skill of the enemy, which is not something that you'll do very often, right? Weapon skill 5 against weapon skill 5 still means you'll hit on 4s, and it can be very tricky to capitalize on that weapon skill, if you really need to. But they do also have Strength 5, which means that when on the attack, they'll have Strength 7, which is really, really good. On the defense, they'll have Strength 5, which means that they can still dish out significant damage and get through enemy armor, because Strength 5 is a -2 penalty to armor. But, it's not unexpected that they would be a very top-ranked unit. But they are very expensive. They're like 50 points each or something like that, which is a very high cost to pay for each of these knights. Which means that something like Unstable is very tricky, right? If the Blood Knights lose combat, then you will lose additional Blood Knights that are very, very expensive. And that is a significant factor, that you have to think about. Like, you have to make sure that when you charge them in there, they're going to break the unit that they're going to charge. Because if they don't, and they lose combat, you've potentially lost quite a lot of investment for, potentially, enemy chaff infantry. Like, if you charge these into a big block of goblins, and the goblins somehow won the combat, then you'd lose Blood Knights, which are incredibly expensive, 2 goblins, which is not something that you want to do. And finally, Grail Knights, the very best cavalry in the game, huzzah, right? I feel a little bit more vindicated now with my Bretonnian video, now that I've actually made this. So we have a pretty strong profile. They're not fully supernatural, they're not like vampire levels of strength, The main reason why I think that Bretonnian knights do really, really well here is their durability. So I've mentioned, of course, that the main problem with the vampires is their lack of durability. All cavalry units that I've compared so far have 1 wound each, which means that once you've lost that wound, that unit is dead, which is not good. But the Grail Knights have a 6+ ward save base, which is pretty good, but that 6+ becomes a 5+ on strength 5 attacks or more. And that is very important because, of course, a lot of cavalry in this game will hit with strength 5 or more. Either because they're charging, or because they just have naturally high strength stats. And these are this durability perk is very important because a 1/3 chance to ignore all damage is a very, very good defensive buff, because it means that it has a 1/3 chance of keeping a knight still in the fight with all of his attacks, all of his benefits, and so on and so forth. And it also means that if the armor is not strong enough to breach it, you have another additional defense. So you'll have a 2+ armor save and then a 5+ ward save. It's a very, very strong defense. And that means that these Grail Knights can outlast the enemy to survive their fights, keep fighting, and win the combat. The Lance formation also makes them especially potent on the charge because they get additional attacks. And that can significantly increase their charge potential. But despite the fact that they do well on the charge, their survivability makes them also exceptional on the defense as well. Okay, so now we looked at the top 3, let's look at the bottom 3. So the Centigors struggle in a lot of ways. They don't have a second mount profile, so it means that they're not doing as many attacks as they could be compared to other units. They've got weak armor and low survivability. Now, the fact that they have those special rules of Drunken and Primal Fury means that I don't think they're as terrible as they might seem, especially if you get lucky. If you get lucky with, +2 initiative or something like that, that can be a significant boon to help you in the fight, as opposed to, other types of cavalry units that have, worse stats. But when it comes to Centigors, I really don't think they should be, you really have to use them as light cavalry. They absolutely cannot do frontal charges, because that would be suicide for them with their low armor. You have to use them for attacking enemy units in the flank or in the rear. And they're relatively mobile, so I think you could get away with it. The Boar Boyz are an interesting case because I like them conceptually. I really like the idea of like a very heavy cavalry in a more literal sense of the word heavy. But there are lots of reasons why they don't do very well. The first is that they have terrible initiative, right? Initiative is king in Warhammer Fantasy, and Boar Boyz have initiative 2, which is only matched by the undead. So they have very, very poor stats in that regard. And often what you'll see is that the Boar Boyz will get charged or charge an enemy, and the enemy will have a higher initiative than them. So that enemy unit will attack first, inflict a bunch of casualties on them, and the Boar Boyz will not inflict the same level of casualties back. They'll break because they suffered a morale check, a leadership check, and they have low leadership, so that's another problem. The Boars do help on the charge with their additional strength, but not enough, right? More attacks, I think, would fundamentally help the unit, but I don't think it would necessarily change it, right? I do think, you also have to factor in their reliability issues. In this, investigation, the Boar Boyz are always assumed to charge into combat, but the issue is that, in real use, it's probably not as likely you will always get them in the position you need them to be in to actually even charge properly. So I think the fact that they get charged more often than they do charge is probably more reflective of, at least some of your playing experience. That being said, I do still like the idea of the unit. I would love to see someone, try to build an Orc cavalry army. I think that would be a very interesting proposition. I think it could be done. The Orcs do have a lot of diversity amongst their units, but I do think that stuff would have needed to have been changed to get the Boar Boyz to be where they need to be. Finally, we have the Skeletal Horsemen. Now, I think a large reason why the Tomb King Skeletal Horsemen are bad is because their codex was outdated. I guess it's funny because the Bretonnians were also a similarly out-of-date codex, but the Grail Knights are still really, really good. But the Tomb Kings were just lagging behind significantly by the end of Warhammer 8th edition. And so, with abysmal stats, they just weren't ever going to be able to compete. Weapon skill 2, initiative 2, that's just not going to cut it. They're not going to be able to hit much. They're not going to be able to hit first. They're going to get killed in droves, lose combat, suffer unstable, which ordinarily being unbreakable helps. But the fact that they're unstable with, their low stats means that they're just going to take a lot of casualties and take further casualties. Now, fear can help them. It can negate fear on enemy units, but it can cause fear on some other units. You noticed that in the results you saw that they often tended to rout enemy units a lot more than they tended to destroy them. Well, that's probably because they caused fear, and using that fear ability, if an enemy unit failed their leadership check, they'd be reduced to weapon skill 1, which means that you can get away with their weapon skill 2, and hopefully, do some significant damage, enough to cause the enemy unit to break. But still really, really underpowered. Okay, so a couple of other final fun insights. So it's really funny to me that the Dragon Princes are beaten out by the Cold One Knights. Ulthuan will not recover from this insult, I'm sure. The Cold One Knights are generally better than the Cold One Riders, which does make sense. Even though you've got the stupidity rule, it isn't really a factor in this particular case. In a 1-to-1 fight, I think the Dark Elf definitely adds more to the Cold One than the Saurus Warrior does. The Empire Knights are very weak. Relatively speaking, they're very, very weak, but the fact that they have that Dwarf Forged armor means that they compete way higher than you think they would in terms of their profile, just because they have a 1+ armor save. And the final thing that I find really funny is the best cavalry in the game are ostensibly all human. Yeah, that's really weird, isn't it, right? Like, in a fantasy setting like Warhammer, the best cavalry in the game are still some flavor of human. You've got chaos humans, but ostensibly they're still human. You've got Bretonnia, right? And you've got human vampires, which I think is just really funny, right? Despite the success of, things like Dragon Princes and so on and so forth, it turns out that humans still are the cavalry game for the most part. Okay, finally, I wanted to talk about efficiency and points, right? As you'll notice, of course, that not all of the units in the game have the same points cost, and we were fighting with 15 models per unit, which means that some of these units were significantly more expensive in points than others, right? And I wanted to account, so I kept the unit size fixed because that would make formation stuff easier to work out. But, it is a very valid question. Like, Skeletal Horsemen perform poorly, but generally speaking, they're much cheaper than other types of horsemen, so you can afford to have a lot more of them, which I think is a fair statement to make. So I thought I would try to calculate the point efficiency of these different units, and what you see here are summaries of that calculation. So we have basically the number of wounds that a unit will do for the number of points that you've spent on that unit. So for 1 point, for example, Empire Knights will do 0.01 wound. And at 50, you get to 0.5. At 100 points, you get 1, and at 500, you get 5. So remember, these are just basically, I just calculated the number of wounds that we did in combat, and then we sort of aggregated them out. Obviously, in a real combat, you probably, you can expect to do a lot more. The dice can be very swingy. You could do a lot of damage. You could do no damage at all. But this gives you kind of a sense of how each unit scales as its efficiency goes up. Like, you'll see that the Skeletal Horsemen do abysmally, but because they're so cheap, they have a fairly effective, points efficiency at 500 points. Whereas something like the Dragon Princes, which didn't do as well as we'd expect them to, have a comparable points efficiency to Grail Knights. And something like Blood Knights have a very low point efficiency because they're very, very expensive, right? That's something to keep in mind when you're doing your planning, right? Even though the Blood Knights are really good and they were generally the second best cavalry, their point efficiency is really, really bad because they're very expensive. A 15-point unit of Blood Knights is essentially a huge chunk of your army. In smaller points games, that would be most of your army. And you can't normally do that because of rules about rare, unit allocations and stuff like that. The same is replicated on defending. Here, defending is a much more difficult task than surviving, of course. So you tend to see units that, like for example, Empire Knights and Chaos Knights have a similar point efficiency, despite the fact that they are, vastly different. And that's simply because both knights have that 1+ save, and the points efficiency for the Empire Knights is accounted for in their cost being lower than Chaos Knights. Again, you want to... It is really interesting to see sort of like how these units can go, as you account for more and more points. But yeah, this is just sort of a final sort of cap. Your points efficiency will matter, but in terms of like just pure cavalry damage, your best cavalry are Grail Knights. And they do have pretty decent point efficiency as well. So it's not as if that's completely unearned. It's not as if they're completely insufficient. I would argue that probably Blood Knights are maybe overcosted a little bit for their stuff, or maybe their stats need to be increased for the price that they're costed at. So, looking at our conclusion, I think this was quite a lot of fun to put together. In terms of building a sort of a statistical model that could calculate all of this stuff, it was quite fun. I did need to make a lot of simplifications, as I've talked about, right? To make sure that I understood the formation rules and all of that other stuff. It really was a walk down memory lane for me because I grew up playing various shades of Warhammer Fantasy, and 8th edition was something that I played for a long time. So I got to refresh my understanding of those rules, which is always a good time, and learn a little bit more about the intricacies of game design. I don't think these 8th edition rules are necessarily a bad set of rules. I think they are very complicated, but that's not necessarily bad. I also don't think that this test is 100% conclusive because, of course, different units have different use cases. You can, use different units in various different ways. And if your unit is achieving what you want it to do, then that is much more effective than just blindly charging them into a, enemy cavalry unit that will, for certain, get them killed. The points efficiencies also, I think, should sway your assessments because some units are definitely a lot less efficient for their points than others, but you don't have a choice. If you're a cavalry, if you only have one cavalry choice in your whole army, then you'll pick that cavalry choice, And the other thing is, of course, lots of players will often stack buffs. When I played with Empire, what I would often do is put a warrior priest with the Empire Knights to give them hatred, which means they can reroll their hits in the first round of combat. And that is already just a huge bonus. But I didn't include character buffs and stacking things like that, just because I don't have all the time in the world. So yeah, you've got your general power levels. I think that's, for me, the most interesting thing. I had expected the Blood Knights to be the best unit, because they're the most expensive cavalry unit. But I really do think that the Grail Knights had a lot to offer. I was obviously hoping for other types of units to do better than they did. Certainly, I think it would have been really interesting to see something like a elf comparison, maybe. To really dig in deep on the different types of elf units that you get. But yeah, there we go. That's our complicated analysis video. So, in conclusion, everybody, thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe. Let me know, if you would like to see more videos like this. I can't promise I can make them that often because they take a lot of time and effort to make. But I appreciate the view time nonetheless. I also would like to say that the video production has been really good. Thank you everyone for the 100 subscribers. Awesome. Never, it's happened really quickly, so I'm very happy about that. Video production will be a little bit reduced over the coming weeks because of travel and work and stuff. But yeah, just always let me know what you think in the comments below, and take care.